Now let's talk about some of the anatomy of the nervous system. The nervous system has specialized cells called neurons. They're very unique. They have a lot of unique parts of them that most cells don't have. You'll notice that they have this weird branching stuff off the top that we'll talk a little bit about. They have this long body, and they have these weird ends to them. Now, the direction of nervous impulse goes from the head to the tail almost. Okay, so we're going to be talking a little bit about that throughout this section of the notes. So if you think about them having three parts, you kind of have the cell body, the axon, and the axon terminals. So we'll look at that, the specialized parts of a neuron. The cell body is where all the DNA is, the nucleus, all the organelles. That's inside of here. It's also referred to as the soma. Now, it also has these branches off of it called dendrites. They receive information. Receive like stimulus. Whether it's from another neuron or from some sort of outside stimulus, this is where information gets received, and then it gets sent throughout this long part called the axon. You can see the axon underneath these cells that are wrapped around that form what's called the myelin sheath. The axon is the long part. There are some neurons, some nervous cells, okay, that are over a foot long in our body, okay? And so these cells are definitely can be extremely long because they have to make up our nerves. There's three types of neurons. We have sensory neurons that detect stimuli and send it to the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord. So I'll show you the sensory neuron here in blue. This is the sensory neuron. Okay. We have these interneurons. I'll show right here in yellow, right? Okay, that then can detect, that can communicate. They're usually inside of the nervous system. They kind of process information and figure out, okay, where is that sense coming from? Where's that stimulus coming from? Now what do I need to do to respond? And then they will then act upon motor neurons that then do some sort of response. In this case, it would be, we'll talk a little bit about this reflex arc later, but the stimulus here is sensed by the sensory neuron, goes to the spine, and then goes out through the motor neuron, which acts on the hamstring muscle and causes some sort of response. Neurons transmit electrical signals. This electrical impulse is known as an action potential. Oops. IAL. And the action potential travels, it starts right here at the very beginning called the axon hillock. And then it goes bam, 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 bam. It bounces. It only travels in the exposed parts of the axons. These Schwann cells that wrap around our neurons and our nerves are kind of like insulation that don't allow ions to run in and out of the cell. Without these, the action impulse would be very slow, and it would slow down our nervous system. There are degenerative diseases that these cells get kind of broken down, like multiple sclerosis, and can affect our nervous system. So we need these things to keep our nervous system acting fast. And the little gaps that they form are called nodes of Ranvier. At the end of our neurons, so if this is the one neuron, here's the dendrites, right? Here's the axon, and here's the axon terminals, right? This is an axon terminal at the end. So this would be like zooming in right there. And here's another neuron. This is how our brain kind of communicates with all the cells. They don't actually touch. So I'm zooming in like right here. And here's another axon, right? And here's another axon terminal. Here's another neuron, right? We just continue on and on. Here's some dendrites, right? And here's a dendrite. They don't actually touch. So if I want to communicate an electrical impulse that starts here and goes all the way through, I have to play this tag you're it, and the impulse has to jump across this gap, and this gap is right here, and it's called a synapse. And the way that it does that is by communicating through these chemicals called neurotransmitters. All of our neurons can fire an electrical impulse because they all start with a slight negative charge on the inside. So the inside of our neurons are a little bit negative. That's called the resting potential. And the outside is a little bit positive. Okay, there's a lot of sodium on the outside of our cells, not a lot on the inside, but a lot of potassium on the inside and not a lot on the outside. And what happens is, in order to fire an electrical potential, we're going to open up these channels. Sodium rushes in, potassium rushes out, and it causes this kind of electrically charged impulse to travel along the length of our neurons through these ions. Sodium is an ion because it's positively charged. Potassium is an ion because it's positively charged. It has lost an electron. And it's these ions that are the electrical system of your brain and your spinal cord. And those ions are pumped back using a sodium-potassium pump. So this action potential is created by channels. There are literally channels, proteins that allow ions to flow in and out of the axon. Sodium flows in, potassium flows out, and then there are pumps that put them back together again. So this is what causes this impulse to travel along this axon. Once it reaches the end, guys, that's where all the brain chemistry comes in. Once that action potential, that positive, negative, negative, positive, right, this in and out of ions, that action potential, once it reaches the end, it causes these synaptic vesicles that contain these neurotransmitters inside of them to release these chemicals. These neurotransmitters are inside of our neurons, and they travel along the synapse, right, synaptic space, bond to receptors of the postsynaptic neuron, and cause this guy to fire. This is how drugs work. Understanding this little gap. This is how our brain chemistry works. If we take drugs, it affects the release of these chemicals, the reuptake of these chemicals, the blocking of these receptors, the activating of these receptors. We have drugs that mimic these neurotransmitters. Okay, an example of these neurotransmitters is one called dopamine, right? Which is the neurotransmitter that is involved in getting high. That's why they call it dope.